So, just for the purposes of remembering, first of all, let me point out, I knew Kathy before she was the Kathy Acker you all know. I met her in San Diego. That is, she was a young student from Brandeis who was a graduate student who was employed as a teaching assistant by the literature department to teach Greek. That is, she was teaching classical Greek at, I guess, to elementary undergraduate students. And she came with a husband whose name was Acker. This husband whose name was Acker was not only a philosophy graduate student, nominally studying with Marcuse. It is not at all clear to me that Acker ever studied anything whatever, but I do remember seeing him sitting in the library, gloomily looking at a book. Now, gloomily looking at a book may, in fact, carry you fairly far sometimes, but I'm not sure it carried him close to Kathy, who had a kind of involvement with a whole group of other people, other apparent refugees from Brandeis, like Mel Freilicher, who were, I guess Mel may have been her closest friend. And I met them when I came out there. Now, when I came out there, this was spring of 1968 when I came out to San Diego. And you may not remember 1968, but I arrived the day that I arrived in Phoenix, in Phoenix, Arizona, to find out that Andy Warhol, who I'd seen about a week before that, had just been shot. And nobody knew what was the outcome of the shooting. It was on the eve of the Robert Kennedy campaign for the presidency, and he was making a speech in Los Angeles, and we went to bed early, and we decided we would wake up much earlier than that and drive my wife and my one-year-old son, who was not yet quite 1 year old, drive across the desert early before the heat hit it. And I came out with Ellie into the motel lobby, and I heard someone saying on the telephone, "I don't believe it, I don't believe it." And I said to Ellie, "They killed Kennedy." And he was not yet dead. This was the year of the assassinations, the year of Martin Luther King. It was shortly after the insurrections or uprisings of black communities all around the country. You have to remember what year this was. It was the year, it was also a time of the kind of proclaimed sexual revolution. I mean, in a certain sense, Kathy, I was very grateful for Barrett reminding us about 1973 and the SLA, which it seems to have disappeared from the radar screen. But not from memory, because just as a point of digressive amusement, when I was driving home from Cal Arts, the newly found place where I was giving a lecture, or I was teaching a course at Cal Arts, so I was a professor at the University of California in San Diego, and I had close connections with the Cal Arts people. I was driving home on the freeway and listening to an account of the police more or less apparently having cornered the SLA in a house in Los Angeles. And I was hearing that they were firing back and forth. And suddenly I arrived at a traffic jam. And what was going on there was I could see from the highway, on 405 highway heading towards San Diego, I could see a gun battle going on that was being described on the radio where I was stalled in traffic. People would stop to watch the SLA fighting it out, apparently or seemingly, with the police. And the reportage was something like, "There's a native running for cover." I wasn't sure what a native of Los Angeles would be doing running for cover, and the firing was going on back and forth, and I kept wondering, are we going to wait till somebody is extinguished here before we get out of here? Finally, we moved on and later found out that the police were firing at each other. They were, without realizing it, they were on both sides of a house, each time the police on one side of the house fired, the police on the other side thought their fire was being made upon them by the SLA, who had slipped out of the house. And this was going on and kept me in this traffic jam for about half an hour. Now, this is the background climate into which a great deal of our experience of San Diego was built. When I got to San Diego, finally, I thought that I would find out from people who were very concerned about whether Robert Kennedy had died. We drove into Solana Beach, tiny beach town, and we didn't have a refrigerator, so I went to a place to look for a refrigerator, one of those used places that they sell all sorts of crap. And it was filled with photographs of Adolf Hitler, taken up close by people who must have known him. and two elderly gentlemen were having a conversation with each other in which one of them said he deserved what he got. 20 bucks for the refrigerator, and I got out of there in a hurry. There was a feeling of this was a very strange part of the world. That San Diego was really, if San Diego was America, what was New York? Spalding Gray had said it was an offshore island, and maybe he's right. But this was the world into which we came, and '68 was the year of the student rebellions and everything else going on. So that the climate in which Kathy came to be a poet, in my sense, Kathy is a poet. That is to say, she may write things that some people call novels, and it may address novels as a genre intermittently. But my sense is that she's a poet in the sense that poetry is the language art. There are applied, the way mathematics is the art of all mathematical conception, and then there's something called accounting. Well, that's like the novel. Well, I got involved in it once myself. briefly, took too long, but I got involved with it at one point. But in any case, when I met Kathy, I was the director of the art gallery, and but the situation that was there was complicated. The only reason Eleanor and I, my wife Eleanor and I, went out to San Diego at all was after consulting with Jackson McLeod. I said, Jackson, have you any idea about San Diego? Now, I don't know why I asked Jackson. He was probably the most unreliable informant about anything, although totally honest. His view of the world is always upside down, but I thought it would provide me with an alternative to the glamorous picture they gave me of how exciting it was. And because other people told me, what is it? It's a group of scientists handing with an open checkbook under a palm tree. And for a princely salary that was double what I had made as a Herbert Lehman Fellow when I was doing my doctoral work in linguistics, I decided a princely salary of $11,500 a year, which was twice what I was getting as a fellow and a graduate student in linguistics at NYU. I agreed to go out there, direct the gallery, and teach a couple of courses. So I got out there, and I rapidly found that because I was a poet, that is, I had already published 2 books of poems fairly recently, and one of which had been reviewed in Poetry by Gilbert Sorrentino in a rather generous manner. Otherwise it would be unknown completely, but they, on the basis of my being a poet, the literature department asked me if I would teach a poetry course. I had never taught poetry in my life. I had been a poet since the 1950s, in the late 1950s. I entered into the poetry scene in the late 1950s. And that's what a course like this. And there were a number of people who included Kathy Acker and Mel Freiliger. And I don't know what, I had very bad experience of what people thought poetry was, and what kids would have it as generally they would figure that they would express their psychic state. And then I'd have the problem of if anything I said rude about the work, they would feel it was an attack on them and not about work. And I had to find a way to get out of this problem, even though I had volunteered to help. So I said, look, I'm not good at psychology. I don't know anything about it. But look, do me a favor. Let's do the work this way. You can write about anything in the world you want, except if it has to come, if any issue in the world that you want to write about, somebody else knows more about it than you, and it's already in a book in the library. Go to the library and steal it. I said, so whenever something comes up about something, go to the library, take someone who's already written better about this than you could possibly do at this moment in your life, and we'll consider the working of putting the pieces together like making a film. Then I can deal with work. I said, it's simple. I mean, I could deal with a working procedure. Somebody would be doing something, and we could look at it as if we had a film. It goes from here to here to here. It doesn't work too well going from here to here to here. And then I don't have to kill anybody's poor, unfortunate, shatterable soul. Which I didn't say. Now, my experience was this, that they all found this a little surprising, but did it. They did it in the beginning, and they got very good at it. Within about 4 or 5 weeks, they were producing rather wonderfully quick, shifting, beautiful things that were like race drivers shifting gears like crazy for every turn. And they were really doing very good. But after a while, you see, the library was a bit of a walk. People don't like to walk so much in Southern California. After a while, they started to fake it. They were so good at it, they made believe they were using found material. And I pretended not to know the difference. Now, that's the basic background out of which this operated. But again, there was a sense of free construction that this allowed them. That is, freedom where their soul was not being judged, so that every time they stole something, they changed it because, you know, things don't fit with each other so brilliantly. You know, like a piece of Aeschylus in a plumbing manual have to be brought together in some sort of way. If you want it to be like a car collision on I-5, you can make it do that. But you might want it to slip into each other as if, you know, as if Aeschylus was being sodomized by the plumbing manual. You know, so you probably had to develop ways of seduction that allowed these pieces to go together. You wrote bridges. Very often they wrote much more than bridges. Very often they summarized these works. They took a quick look at them. First of all, I mean, I just want to suggest to Peter that all the works that he cited when he gave them, I'm sure Kathy looked at. Some she looked at the spine. Some she read thoroughly. Some she encountered rather glancingly, but she encountered them the way a real poet would encounter them, as usefully as possible. Now, in this environment, remember what the environment was like in which Kathy encountered things. That is, first of all, Kathy encountered art, because it's one of the things that happened early in the year was I was writing on conceptual art, and I was the West Coast editor for an issue of Studio International that Charles Harrison was putting together on conceptual art. And Seth Siegelau, the manager, one of the main dealers of conceptual art, if you could deal it, I mean, came by with Joseph Kassouf. Well, in those days, nobody could deal with it. It was, I mean, you could only enjoy it. Joseph Kassouf and Larry Weiner came by to do a Larry Weiner work, and they were visiting in my house. And this is the kind of people that Kathy would meet, because Kathy and I were very close. Kathy and my wife and I were very close. She was like a kid sister, you know, which was, in a sense, a human relationship. I mean, when you said she was my daughter's baby, see, I only have a son, but the fact is his name is Blaise Sandra Antin, and it was a little bit later, and she was his favorite babysitter. It's true. Mel was his other great. Mel Freilacher, the writer, was his other favorite babysitter. So there was a personal relation that made sure that she knew all of Eleanor's work as well as Seth Siegelau's work. Actually, they were there for Larry Weiner to complete a conceptual work, the instruction for which was throw an object from one country to another. So they were going to the Mexican border, where they would stand somewhere on the border, unprotected by the vast protectors of the sanctity of the borderline, and they were going to throw a carton of, I believe, Camel cigarettes across the border, which they did notably, and nobody was shocked by this, as it happened rather quietly, and then they went away. You know, I suppose somebody might regard it as being in a class with Gerard de Nerval's Promenade down, it was with the Bois de Boulogne with a lobster, which he proudly walked along the street, and when they asked him why, he said, you know, after all, it doesn't bark and it knows the secrets of the deep. So, and he may never have said it, but I like to think that Nerval said exactly that. So, and I don't know what Larry said to some guard, somebody who was watching the border, but he threw the carton of cigarettes across the border. Now, I put on, early on, I staged with Lawrence Alloway, the English but New York-based critic, a massive show of Fluxus art, for which Kathy and my friends were absolutely passionate observers. It also caused a scandal in the local newspapers, I mean, because San Diego was not only the furthest westmost place in the country, it was also the furthest rightmost place in the country. It was a military base with chutzpah, you know. Except, well, in fact, they had no Jews in that country, until the university came in. And all the noble people of La Jolla fought the appearance of a university on the grounds that a university would destroy the entire neighborhood. But they lost the people who thought that the economics of the university would redeem everything, even the presence of Jews. The presence of blacks and Hispanics were invisible, and there were very few blacks in the area, and they were totally invisible in this kind of bizarre culture until considerably later. I mean, it was a sparklingly or dull white bread community, depending on which side you looked. I thought of it essentially as sliced white bread. Now, except for the wonderfully massive collection of idiosyncratic people who were in the university, where Kathy spent quite some time. That is much more time than you believe, because she was there twice. Once she stayed there long enough to run off with Martha Rossler's husband. That is, Kathy Acker, and then she went to New York, where she had an apartment right above Jerry and Diane Rothenberg's apartment, where Jerome and George Quasha were in the process of putting together America, a Prophecy, perhaps the most generous and broadly based anthology of American poetics that could have been found at the time. And Jerome had already done the kind of Technicians of the Sacred, which took the broadest view of poetics that could be had. It was a view of non-Western poetries, American Indian poetries, African American poetries. I mean, there was a kind of broad range of stuff that he took there, that he put together. And she was living right upstairs with the poet Lenny Neufeld, who had once been Martha's husband. They went down, and they spent a lot of time helping with that. That is, I believe they didn't help with that, maybe they didn't help with the layout of that, but my sense is they were deeply involved, and Jerome and Diane were in the midst of compiling this thing, which was a partnership between Jerry and George Quasha. But the anthropological background was Diane Rothenberg, who was an anthropologist. So, this is kind of the whole part of the background, but not the whole thing either. Marcuse was known to have been a sparkling figure and a provocative figure in the philosophy department, and he had a great number of literary disciples who followed him around. That is to say, Fred Jameson and Reinhard Lettau and Tony Wilden. You used to see Marcuse, a kind of Middle European intellectual, sort of elderly intellectual, who used to kind of parade down La Jolla streets with his hands behind his back as if he were walking down the streets in some wonderful German city, peering at the bakery windows, looking longingly at whipped cream cupcakes. But he would walk down there because it was the only thing like a street. There are no streets. You may not realize San Diego has no street life. There are no streets. So La Jolla was a kind of like funny little street where he would be there. But Tony Wilden was, if anybody remembers, was the author of a kind of questionably accurate translation of the work of Lacan. And it was popular there because he was there. Jameson was there at the same time as a young professor, and so the literature department was filled with excitement. And the French wing were pretty lively. I'm trying to remember which of the members of there were a whole succession of terrific Frenchmen who were there. Michel Benamou came fairly early. Later, Michel de Certeau appeared, who died unfortunately after leaving. I told him he shouldn't have gone away. Well, he had a lust to get back to Paris, as all good Frenchmen have, and he went away and unfortunately died shortly there. But he spent several years there also, and was part of the environment. Some of it was when Kathy was there later, some of it was Kathy was there before. But she was exposed to almost all of these people in varying ways that were useful for her. That's the one point I want to make clear, is that she was not a systematic type any more than any of us had been. And of course, I did teach in its early days. I did teach a course in theoretical, in semiotic theory, where there were no texts yet to use except that were not in English. Everything was in French, and so I used to be free to translate, which was all right. Some of the kids could read it pretty well, some of them couldn't, and we would translate it. In fact, I taught one whole course using as the only complete semiotic text the Interpretation of Dreams, saying it's the only one that has what I call a morphology, a syntax, a semantics, and a pragmatics. You may not believe any part of it, but the point of it is a beautifully constructed system that can be regarded as a model for any semiotic system that would be thorough. They actually thought this was a very good idea. and produced radical alternative works. There were all sorts of questions about it that they produced. And she had an experience of all of these things going on in the area very much. But let me say something about the way I think she composed. She composed the use of rules, as I understood her relation to rules, was as free to some degree as Eleanor Antin's construction of her quasi-narrative of 100 Boots. That is, Ellie, one day I was, and she, by the way, she had a close relation to this. She helped Ellie mail them out. And the Black Tarantula mailings were mailed to Ellie's mailing list. So the 100 Boots was a work in which one day I came home, Eleanor said, "David, what do you think about 100 boots facing the sea?" I said, "I don't know, I've never seen it." She said, "Well, I'm thinking of putting 100 boots out there, they're going to face the sea." I said, "Well, go do it, let me see what happens." She went and bought 100 boots, 100 rubber boots, it was pretty cheap, and she had somebody photograph them. But once you have 100 boots, you're not going to do one thing with them. So, you went to the trouble of having 100 boots, so you sort of have to schlep them around a bit and do a couple of more places. She made about 5 images of 100 boots. 100 boots go to the market, 100 boots go to church, 100 boots at the bank, and then they had committed their first crime. 100 boots trespass. She put them inside one of those relay power things with the transformers, and she had photographed them, and then she had them hitting the road. 100 boots hit the road. They get away. And after that, and these things were sent out once a month. And it was a terrible drag because it was sent out to a mailing list consisting mostly of the art and literary worlds, and the mailing lists of Vito Acconci and John Perrault and all sorts of other people who were friends of ours and of Eleanor's and were gallery mates of theirs in an experimental gallery. And of course, that's where, literally where Kathy got the mailing list that handled the rest of the possibility of dealing with the Black Tarantula. Was she had one of the things you got to realize about her was her great seductivity as a human being. She was able to con the Solana Beach newspaper into letting her print them up on their press. It was cheap. Well, it was cheap, and mailing them was cheap, because in those days, first-class mail was very cheap, and like Ellie used to pay something like 8 cents to mail out a postcard. You mail it out to 8,000 people, you haven't spent a lot of money. All you had to do was pay for printing them up into postcards, which are a few $100, and so it was still conceivable artwork that didn't cost a fortune. It was poor people's art, or people's art. That is, anybody could do it if they had the intelligence and the energy, and Kathy had both intelligence and energy. And she had desire. Now, the thing about desire with Kathy is the word desire is almost always made sexual, but Kathy had a desire for life. There was a sort of intensity of her desire for life. Now, I've had philosophical discussions of the meaning of desire, and I've done other works where I've related to it. My argument is that when Jean-Paul Sartre opened his big mouth and said desire refers to an absence, it was a stupid thing to say and conventional. Desire, as I see it, not only doesn't refer to an absence, it refers to an abundance of energy and a superfluity. It is, in fact, a marvelous, positive, engendering thing. It is the range of things. In fact, it is not the absence or lack, because you don't know what you lack. You're going out. You're moving out into the world. Until you recognize an object for your desire, all you have is desire. And desire is the superfluity of your energy moving into the goddamn outer world. And she wanted to move into the outer world. She was constantly moving out into the outer world. And the point of it with her is that her engagement was with so many things, but she had to restrain herself as not to be all over the place all at once. The rule system was essentially a convenience to have her have a way of working that was procedural enough to make sense. I can do this. Working at this, I have a text. I have another text over here, and I got to put the two texts together. It's like, it's like welding or carpentry. It's true I come from an engineering background originally, but I mean, the point is you put things together. You got a working mode. You got something here, you got something there, it goes in here, you have a few others, you have your library, you have your passionate taste for what you hate and what you like, you have what you hate. I think I'm going to put in something I hate. I'm going to take one from what I hate, one from what I love. And it seems to me this is this kind of insensible. Kathy was a sensible artist. She was a sensible working artist, and she did work. This is work. I mean, look, I mean, she had a model even in A Piece of Mind, which her work was very different from. I mean, I did a piece, we were in the midst of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War would never go away. We opposed the Vietnam War when I was living in New York. We marched against it. We wrote poems against it. We read poems in the street about it. People did exhibitions against it. It wasn't going away. Here I was in a university in California, and I figured, I have to figure out where I am in this world. So I figured I'd do some meditations. But you know, you do meditations. Other people have done meditations. I figured I'd take a look. So I went to Marcus Aurelius. But you know, you don't have much in common with an emperor. So I decided I better look at a slave, a Hellenistic slave. So I went to Epictetus. You know, and Epictetus was very sensible, but it was all Epictetus's world, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I said I kept studying and studying and seeing if there was some way I could have access. And I couldn't until one day I came home and I found it open to the footnotes, apparently written by a kind of late Victorian scholar. And the footnotes, I had it open to the footnotes, and because I was reading the Greek with the footnotes, and it said, the place is where you are now. And it was like reading a tarot, it's not with I Ching. I said, that's it, I'm going to work my way through the footnotes. So I gave myself a task, and the task was very much like a kind of Kathy task. That is, I was going to work my way through the footnotes, taking a phrase or two, a phrase from each footnote as they were numbered, taking at least a word from every footnote thing, and work my way through the system, trying to make coherent sentences out of them that somehow had in mind what I had in mind. What mind? There was no mind of them. It was my mind trying to put them together. The way Kathy's mind is always putting her things together. And all I did is I worked my way around it. Now, people said that she was improvisatory and she wanted to be casual. Or maybe they said that she was sloppy about it, but she wasn't. There's a certain reason for being casual about this. Like, I worked in the noisiest part of the house. There were a lot of kids running in and out. I only had one kid, a little boy. But he had lots of friends, and they would run in and out of the house. And I'd have my electric typewriter set up next to my copy of Epictetus's footnotes, open to the footnotes, and so that I would not be finicky. In other words, the worst thing you can do in literature in writing is to get finicky. When I started with a Flaubertian model of hammering sentences out of steel, you know, and I was like moving in revulsion from this. And I think Kathy was working against that kind of perfection. I think she was also influenced by someone like Robert Duncan. Yeah, Duncan. Yeah, Duncan is someone one shouldn't forget. There's an essay by Duncan in Culture that shows more or less Duncan's disdain for revision, and which was part of a kind of playful ability that what your mind does is already going to be shapely if you're using your mind really. And I think that Kathy was very aware of this. One thing I want to say about Kathy in conclusion is that Kathy had a shapely mind. It was shaping a mind that shaped, and the mind was shapely. And what she did was in the interest of shape of some sort or another. She could feel the impulses to form and the impulses to come to closure when they came, and she could struggle with saying, I'm not going to let it close yet, I'm not going to let it close. Now it's over, you know? And I think that's how you would suggest she worked. And to this day, I find her a dazzlingly charming and funny and brilliantly powerful writer whose work I've always felt very close to, though my work resembles it in no way at all on an obvious surface level.